Welcome to the Historical Society of Carroll County's Talk at the Tavern. It's a Zoom presentation. It's August 20th, 2020, and I'm Chris McMasters, Board Chair of the Historical Society of Carroll County. Tonight we have a special treat. We have a master gardener, Dave Flora, who will give us a virtual tour of the Kimmey House Garden and talk about native plants. There's now an increasing awareness of the advantages of using native plants, and Dave will provide us some information that may trigger you into thinking about your own garden. He's supported by Courtney Coddington of the University of Maryland, and Courtney is Carroll County's home horticultural agent and master garden program coordinator. Before I continue, I want to thank our partners in making this presentation possible. The Community Media Center, always professional and a pleasure to work with, and Cone Creative for some of our graphics. I'd also like to thank the Carroll Nonprofit Center and their Executive Director, Mark Kreider, and the staff for allowing us to use their offices for a superior online connection. I would like to thank Bill Palm. Bill Palm is an HSCC board member. He's with us on the board. He's chair of the library committee and is so very helpful with coordinating volunteers and master gardeners to work in the gardens behind our historical society buildings. We are looking for some new volunteers in the garden and the library. So thank you, Bill, for helping us recruit master gardeners to speak at several of our talks of the Tavern this year. Now, I know by now some of you are old hands at this Zoom business. And maybe you're getting a little tired of some of the overview that we give, but let me just add a few common points for new people. We have muted everyone's audio for this speaker's presentation, but just to make sure there are no disruptions, please turn off your microphones and videos. Both toggles are found in the lower left corner of your Zoom screen. Some of you may be tired to listening to some of these instructions, but we also recommend to new listeners that you use the active speaker view rather than the gallery view. It's at the top right corner of your Zoom screen. If you see the word speaker, you're fine. If you see the word gallery, click on it and you'll switch to the speaker view. This way, the speaker will be the largest window on your screen. This presentation is being recorded for the future, so we ask that questions be held until the end of the talk. To ask a question via Zoom, you can raise your hand using the chat box. To raise your hand, you'll move your mouse to the bottom of the Zoom window, which a menu will appear, or at the top of your screen if you're using an iPad. And you tap on participant button, and that will bring up a list of participants. At the bottom of the participant list, you will see a raised hand box, and you'll click on that, and you'll see a dialog box asking you to allow us to unmute you. Click yes, and your mic will be unmuted so that you can ask a question. Or what seems to be the more popular way of asking us questions, you can use the chat box feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your question, which I will read aloud. In the chat, you can send a message to everyone or just use the pull down message and just send it to a single participant. I will review these instructions at the end of tonight's presentation. As board chair of the HSCC and as a fellow gardener, today's talk is near and dear to my heart. A few years ago, when the Historical Society was looking for assistance in renovating its overgrown gardens, the master gardeners and Dave Flora volunteered to provide the leadership to develop a native garden to the rear of the Kimmey House, which is at 210 East Main Street in Westminster. He is now supervisor of that native landscape. Master gardeners volunteer to provide science-based information and education to the public by answering questions, developing classes, lectures, and partnering with the community groups to develop educational demonstration gardens like the ones at the Historical Society. And so now I give you Dave Flora.
Welcome to my talk and virtual tour of the Kimmey House Garden. We will embark together on an adventure since this is my first ever Zoom talk. I have been a Master Gardener for about 10 years now. The Master Gardener program tends to promote vegetable gardening, but we also do other things, including what the kind of topic I'm going to talk about tonight. So I have a PowerPoint of, there we go. PowerPoint of pictures of the particular garden that we're going to be talking about, and also native plants that are found in that garden. And as she said, this is the Kimmey House Garden. Behind the Historical Society has 3 buildings. The Kimmey House is kind of the middle one. And because I always approached from the back, it took me a year or more to even learn which one was the Kimmey House. I knew the Tavern, but the other 2 I got confused. All right, I'm trying to get it to advance. Here we go. In 2018, Master Gardeners were asked to work on gardens at the Historical Society. Subgroups have worked on an herb garden, a dye garden, and a Pennsylvania German 4-square vegetable garden behind the Shellman House. I've been part of a group who worked at revamping the garden behind the Kimmey House. We based our work on a plan drawn up by a former Master Gardener. We were unable to exactly follow her plan for budgetary and other reasons. Our emphasis has been to replace perennials and shrubs with natives as much as possible. In this picture, you can see a Washington hawthorn that we planted in 2018 with purple coneflower, some native shrubs, and an exotic dusty miller, which we may replace at some point. One of the fun things about planting the hawthorn was that in the process of planting it, before we had finished, the catbird came and sat in the tree. It was in the hole, but we hadn't put the dirt around the roots yet, so it was checking it out as we were planting it. So why consider natives in your garden? Native plants are adapted to our local climate. That's one reason. In general, insects, birds, and other animals have evolved to rely on native plants. Pollen, nectar, seeds, berries, and yes, even leaves are food for native animals. If you want butterflies, you have to tolerate caterpillars eating the foliage of some of your plants. Some non-native plants are like junk food. Birds eat the berries of Japanese honeysuckle, but don't get the nutrition they would get from native species. The birds then spread the seeds and help spread the honeysuckle, which outcompetes native plants. As a gardener, I'm not a purist. In my home garden, I have a mix of natives and exotics. I try to avoid invasive exotics. Also, cultivars of some natives have lost their benefits to pollinators. An example is some cultivars with double flowers make it difficult for the pollinators like bees to get into the flower to get the nectar and pollen. This is a view from the back corner of the garden with Rubeckia triloba and oak leaf hydrangea in the foreground. Many plants that are popular are natives, such as the species of hydrangea. Colonial gardeners utilize natives such as Cardinal Flower and our native columbine, although most of the columbines you see sold at garden centers are descendants of European species. We extended the garden to an area behind Cockey's Tavern under a huge elm tree. If we identified it correctly, it's an American elm, which is a native. I don't know how the tree has escaped Dutch elm disease because, at least in New England, most of the elms have died from that disease. We removed a non-native ground cover and have planted several native perennials, including the hairy alum root pictured here, Christmas fern, river oats, and New England aster. I will show some of the natives we have in the garden, and then I will mention some other worthy natives to consider as well. This is a cultivar of Heuchera, villosa, or hairy alum root that is close to the wild species, and it will grow in dry shade. This particular cultivar is called Autumn Bride, and it is blooming now. You can see the beginnings of some bloom in that picture, but it's in a little bit more bloom at the present. I think I went too far. There we go. This is another cultivar that's very different in appearance from this species. It's also good in dry shade. This one's called Bronze Wave. It has a very bright yellow We have in a couple of instances planted natives and cultivars or similar non-natives near each other for comparison. So you can see the original native and then a cultivar of that species or something similar to it. Purple coneflower is a popular native perennial. You often see it planted in gardens. There are all kinds of tarted up cultivars in different colors or double flowers, but I prefer the original form. The root of this plant is the source of herbal remedies that are supposed to boost the immune system. I wouldn't recommend trying to create your own medicine, but you can buy echinacea in the vitamin section of many drugstores. It was used for various medicinal purposes by Native Americans, like sun or light shade. It will self-sow if you leave the seed heads on, and birds like to eat the seeds, and native pollinators like the flowers. Northern sea oats or river oats, and I have two Latin names there because botanists keep changing the names around. I think the first one is the more current name. It's a shade-tolerant native grass, and it will spread by seeds, maybe even invasively, unless you cut the seed heads off in the fall. However, to me, the dangling seed heads swaying in the breeze in the fall and winter is one of its main attractions. And stonecrop or sedums, typically most of the cultivars people grow are sun plants that like fairly dry soil. This will grow in fairly dry shade. It is a native plant found in the Appalachian Mountains. We have this cultivar, this is the native, and then a similar cultivar with reddish foliage planted in narrow beds right along the back of the building. If you find a heat pump against the back of the building, one cultivar is on one side and one on the other. It is a low-growing plant, blooms in the early spring. I have it at my house as well as in that garden. Christmas fern is a native evergreen fern that's more drought tolerant than most ferns. It's called Christmas fern because people used to cut the green fronds to use as Christmas greens. In this picture, you can see last year's fronds flat down against the ground after being snowed on over the winter. And I guess if you were a more tidy gardener than me, you could cut off the old fronds once the new ones appear. I tend to let things be a little more natural. This picture was taken at my house, not in the Kimmey garden, but we do have them there. This plant has several common names: Goldstar, green and gold. It is a native perennial, fairly low growing, 6 inches or so. We do have some of this in the garden there. It blooms in the spring and then sporadic bloom through the summer and fall. I was at the garden today. I saw no sign of any bloom on the plants we have there today, but it was blooming earlier in the spring. This is crested iris, Iris cristata. The blue form is closer to the original native. There's a white form, which is what we have in the garden at the Kimmey garden, because I was the donator of the plants and I have the white form at home. So I think we need to find some of the blue and get that there as well, so we have both forms. It blooms in the spring, likes light shade, dry to medium soil. It is a woodland plant, but you won't find it in those rich woodlands that are damp down by the streams. It's going to be up on the hillside somewhere where it's a little drier. So it will, as I said, grow in light shade, not real wet. Blue-eyed grass is another plant that I donated to the garden. This grows wild in Carroll County. It can be used as an edger for beds. It spreads pretty quickly into a tight clump. It does not spread beyond the clump except a little bit by seed, but not much. But it's very easy to divide. If you want more clumps, dig up the clump, divide it into as many pieces as you want, and next year you'll have that many clumps. It blooms in the spring. Looks a lot like grass when it's not blooming, which is why it got that name. We have a different cultivar in the garden near this one that's called lucerne. I think it's either non-native or a, 'a, a, 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 And this is wild geranium, blooms in the spring. The foliage is there all summer. It's a true geranium. Most of the things that people think of as geraniums are actually in a different genus, Pelargonium. But this is the native geranium that grows in our woods here in Carroll County and in the east. It will spread somewhat by rhizomes and seed, but it's not a rapid spreader. But you can divide clumps to get more. Cardinal flower is a favorite plant of many people. It's native to wet areas along streams. It will grow in the flower border if it's not too dry. It's not going to take real drought, but if you have a flower border with rich soil that you don't let get very dry, it will do just fine. It likes full sun, but it will also grow in light shade where it will need a little bit less water. It attracts hummingbirds. I've got it blooming at home, and I've seen the hummingbirds visiting in the last few days. Blooms in July and August. And it's a native that's been long appreciated. There's record that Thomas Jefferson grew this in his garden at Monticello. It will spread by seed if there's bare soil nearby. If you heavily mulch your flower beds, you're not going to have very many seedlings appear. Mulch keeps weeds out, but it also keeps out things you might want to appear seeding on their own. The other thing to say about this and the next one, great blue lobelia, is that in the fall, the flower stalk will die, but down at the ground, there's a basal rosette of leaves that appears, sometimes 2 or 3. If you're one of those people that likes to mulch things, don't cover those basal rosettes because you'll kill the plant, because it does a lot of its growing of roots and so forth over the winter. And even removing the leaves, if you live where I do in the woods, get those leaves off of it in the fall, because if it's covered with leaves all winter, it'll probably be dead by spring. So the great blue lobelia is in the same genus as cardinal flower. The species name of this one, siphilitica, means that at one time people thought it was a cure for syphilis. These two bloom at the same time. At home I have them side by side, and I can't tell which is which until they bloom, because the plants look very similar. And again, both of them will seed themselves in areas where there's bare soil without a lot of mulch. This is a plant that we just added to the garden this summer. It was donated by a couple who thin out their beds every spring. Three-lobed coneflower, Rubeckia triloba. Most of us are familiar with black-eyed Susan, and then there's another one that people call black-eyed Susan, Rubeckia Goldstar. It's actually technically not the black-eyed Susan species. They're 2 different species. This is a 3rd species in the same genus. I like this one because the flowers are smaller, but there's lots of them. And supposedly this one will self-sow. Again, I would think you'd have to not have too much mulch around if you want it to self-sow. It does like full sun. It attracts butterflies. And this picture was taken in the Kimmey Garden. It's in full bloom right now. If you want to drive by sometime this week, it's at the back corner. And Bill on the other side of the room is giving me the thumbs up that it's looking good. White turtlehead is another plant we have in the garden there. It's not a real spectacular bloomer. I took this picture a couple of weeks ago. There's more bloom on the plants now than there was then. But the interesting thing about it is it's a wetland plant, grows in the same habitat as the 2 lobelia species I just talked about a minute ago. It's the primary food for the Baltimore checker spot butterfly, which is an endangered species in our Maryland state butterfly, Maryland state insect. It's known from only 11 sites in Maryland, the butterfly. The plant is more common. One of those is in Carroll County in the northeastern part of the county. So the natural habitat is low wet meadows with little or no woody vegetation. You could plant the plant, and we, as I said, we have it at the Kimmey Garden. I do not expect to see the butterflies because they're not going to fly from northern Carroll County to find it in our garden and lay eggs on the plant. But it's interesting to grow the plant in any case. There are a couple of other native species of Chelone as well as this one that are pink flowered. And I think they're both native in the southern Appalachian Mountains, but they will grow as well. All of these can be grown in a normal flower border. This is one of my favorite ground covers, wild ginger. This picture was taken at my house. That's along the side of my garage. Over the last number of years, it's spread quite well, and it does choke out weeds. There's not anything growing up through it. It's deciduous, which is, I guess, its main disadvantage. If you want an evergreen ground cover, this is not it. But I think it's a good substitute for vinca or periwinkle, which is evergreen. But the vinca is an invasive plant. Doesn't usually spread by seed, but it very rapidly spreads by runners and can take over an area if you're not careful. So this plant will spread, but it's very easy to pull up. It's very shallow rooted. And at my house in the woods, it spreads by seed as well. I've had them come up 10 or 12 feet from where these are. So they're not spreading by roots, they're spreading by seed. But again, it's not anything I would call invasive. It has small brown flowers down under the foliage. If you want to see the flowers, you have to get down on your hands and knees and look for them. You don't grow it for the flowers, but it does bloom. This picture, I have to confess, a few of these I did not take myself. This is one I swiped off the internet, but we do have New Jersey tea planted at the Kimmey House Garden. It's a deciduous shrub, gets 3 to 4 feet tall, blooms in the summertime. It's called New Jersey tea because back in colonial days, the leaves were sometimes used as a substitute for tea, I guess after the Boston Tea Party. It does attract butterflies. And it's one that I'm just becoming familiar with because we planted it there about 2 years ago, and I don't have it at my house, but it is a popular shrub these days. Winterberry holly is in the holly genus. This is a picture of a female, blooms in the summer. It's a deciduous holly. Since it's in the holly genus, you need both male and female plants in order to have berries. One male plant can pollinate a number of females, but you would have to have a male somewhere nearby in order to get berries. There's lots of different cultivars of winterberry holly. Some are more dwarf than others. The typical species can get 10 or more feet tall. Birds like the berries, but they're not their first choice, so the berries tend to hang on into the winter before the birds will eat them all. Inkberry, this picture was taken at the Kimmey Garden. We planted a row of inkberries along either side of the lawn. This is also in the holly genus. It's an evergreen, likes sun to light shade, prefers average to moist soil, doesn't like drought. I'm beginning to think that maybe where we have them planted is a little drier than it would like. It has small black berries that are not ornamental. And again, you have to have male and female in order to get berries. What we planted were the female cultivar called shamrock. Since we only have the female, we won't have any berries, but again, the berries aren't very ornamental anyway. I guess you could consider it a native substitute for boxwood, although it doesn't grow quite as densely as boxwood does. And this is oak leaf hydrangea, which is a popular shrub. There are different cultivars of this. I believe this one's called Snow Queen. It blooms in the summer, has large leaves that are the shape of oak leaves, and they turn kind of a wine red color in the fall. The older stems have peeling bark that's visible in the wintertime. To me, this is a lot more interesting than the old-fashioned blue hydrangeas that you used to see in Victorian gardens. And this one is native, those blue hydrangeas are not. This gets 10, 12 feet tall, unless you buy one of the newer cultivars that's shorter than that. This is wild hydrangea, which is also a native shrub. We have Annabelle. This is a picture of Annabelle, which is a cultivar that has really huge blooms. And typically the blooms are so huge that they flop over. And we had discussed replacing the Annabelle in the Kimmey Garden with the native species, which has smaller bloom heads that don't flop over as much. We didn't get that done before COVID interfered, so maybe next year that'll happen. But anyway, sometimes bigger isn't better. Americans seem to want everything bigger, but sometimes smaller natural flowers look better, at least in my opinion. We planted a witch hazel toward the back of the garden. It's a native shrub or small tree. It's unusual in that it blooms in the fall. This is kind of a close-up of flowers. Again, this is a picture I did not take. Often, at least on some of the plants, when it blooms, it still has leaves which have turned yellow. So you have the bright yellow leaves and the flower at the same time. And this is the plant that's still used to obtain the medicinal witch hazel that you can buy. I guess you can still buy it in drugstores. It's kind of an old-fashioned medicine. At the back of the garden, there are two large specimens of arborvitae, which this is a plant that's been planted for many generations. It's a native plant. There are lots of different cultivars available that are not tree size. These two are tree size, but a lot of houses have arborvitae as a shrub. So this is a native plant that's been used for a long time. I think my grandmother's house had one of these tree size ones in the front yard at the farmhouse in Virginia. Again, a picture I did not take, southern magnolia. There's one of these, a large one up near the building. It's native further south than where we live, but there are cultivars that would survive this far north, even in our colder winters. It has large fragrant blooms in the summertime. Its main drawback is the shedding of its large leathery leaves. The leaves don't decompose very rapidly and they require cleanup. Another master gardener and I have been trying to maintain the garden this summer, and one of our biggest chores other than weeding was picking up all these leaves. If you go there, you'll still see some because we didn't get them all yet. But it is an example of a native that people have planted for a long time, both here and in Europe. Flowering dogwood, most of you are familiar with that, I'm sure. There's one of these in the garden that was there before we started working on it. And that's another native that's very popular and has been planted for a long time. The berries do attract birds in the winter, in the fall and winter. Typically fall, I think they're usually gone by winter. The migrating birds stop and eat them. Dutchman's breeches, in the genus Dicentra, same genus as bleeding heart. This is a spring ephemeral that's native. These pictures were taken at my house, but this spring I snuck in and planted a few of the tubers under some shrubs near that elm tree, near the magnolia tree actually. It's called a spring ephemeral, which means that it comes up in very early spring, blooms and dies down by late spring. These Dutchman breeches, by the end of May, there's no sign of them anymore until the next spring. So why would you want to plant something that isn't there all season? Same reason we want crocus, snowdrops, and other spring bulbs. They bloom before other things are even up out of the ground. Many of our native woodland wildflowers are spring ephemerals. They come up in the deciduous woods, do their thing before the trees leaf out and create shade. And by the time the trees are fully leafed out in late May, they're dying down until next spring. So we'll see if these Dutchman's breeches like where I put them in the Kimmey garden or not. They do quite well at my house and spread by seed. Again, not a weedy plant, but they will spread if they're in a place that they find to be a good place. So beginning with this picture, I want to talk about some other garden-worthy natives that are not found in the Kimmey garden. This is another spring ephemeral, Virginia bluebells. This is not the classic bluebell that you always read about in the English garden books when they talk about the bluebells in England. That's a totally different plant than this. This is our native plant. It's called Virginia bluebell, but I think in Pennsylvania they have a different name for it that has something to do with the locality of Pennsylvania. I'm drawing a blank on their name. But again, this is an ephemeral. These pictures are taken at my house. It comes up, starts showing foliage at the ground level in March, blooms in April. Takes a little longer than the Dutchman's breeches to die down, but by June, it's pretty much gone. And there may be some dead leaves to get rid of if you want to be a little more tidy. It will spread by seed. So I guess you could say it might be invasive, but again, it's not anything that's difficult to dig up, and it's very pretty, so it doesn't bother me. Bloodroot is another native spring bloomer, native in our local woods. I wouldn't call it an ephemeral. The blooms are in April, but the foliage, after the blooms die, the leaves get much larger than you see in that picture. And at my house, the leaves are still there. It depends on how dry the summer is. If it's really dry, they might have died by now, but this summer hadn't been that dry, so there's still foliage there. One of the fun things about this plant, the seeds have something called eliosomes that are attached, and ants like to eat the eliosomes. So they take the seeds and carry them off somewhere and eat the eliosome, and that's how the seeds get spread. In my woods, they've spread all over the place, not by me, but I guess by the ants. But I wouldn't call it an invasive plant. Again, if it's not where you want it, it's got a reddish tuber. It's called bloodroot because it has a red sap in the tuber, which I think has some medicinal quality as well. And it's easy to dig up if you don't want it where it is, unlike some invasives that are hard to get rid of. Shooting star is another really pretty plant. I don't know if you'd call it a spring ephemeral. The foliage lasts maybe into June or July. It comes in white or pink. Either color is native, same species. Prefers light shade. And this plant is the symbol of the American Rock Garden Society. So they think it's worthwhile enough that on their website or any publication they have, there's a picture of this plant. Maidenhair fern is my favorite fern. It likes moist shade. It is deciduous, so it's not going to be evergreen. The fronds kind of vibrate nicely if there's a breeze, which is one of its attractive qualities. This is American Pachysandra. Probably many of you or most of you are familiar with Japanese Pachysandra. Japanese Pachysandra has glossy green leaves. It's an aggressive ground cover. This one, I like the mottled leaves. It's not quite as dense growing. You can see the flowers there in the spring. Although at my house right now, after it blooms, it sends up new foliage, and the clump is dense enough that no weeds are going to grow under or close to the clump. So it can be a ground cover, but it's not going to spread rapidly like the Japanese Pachysandra. And it likes shade and average to moist soil. It doesn't really like drought. Bottlebrush Buckeye. There are several buckeyes that are trees. This one is a shrub, can get pretty large, 10 feet tall, and maybe even wider than that. It sends out suckers to make this big clump. If you have the space for it, it would be a great specimen plant. Blooms in summer. I think July was when mine bloomed this year. Best in sun to part shade. This is at my house. These are in dense shade, and their growth and bloom is not as dense in the shade as it would be in the sun, but it also is something that attracts butterflies. Red buckeye is a small tree up to about 15 feet tall, prefers light shade, doesn't like hot sun and drought. This is a small one that I had planted up behind my house on the side of the hill where it gets fairly dry. Kind of sulked for a couple of years. I moved it about 3 years ago, and it's been growing nicely and has bloomed the last 2 springs. I haven't witnessed this, but supposedly hummingbirds are attracted to the red flowers like they are to most red tubular flowers. It blooms in the spring. There are a number of different species of phlox, and I think one of my books said all but one species of phlox is native to North America. So most of the garden phlox that we grow are cultivars of native species, but there are a couple that I think are particularly nice. This is one of them. One name for it is wild sweet William Phlox divaricata. It's a spring bloomer. The foliage lasts through the summer, has clumps that will slowly spread, prefers part shade and rich soil, although I think you can grow it in sun if it's not too dry. Then we have Phlox stolonifera. This one I use as a ground cover. It grows in the woods. As long as there's not too many leaves falling on it in the fall, it will continue to grow. Blooms in the spring. It's low growing, semi-evergreen. So there's some foliage there all winter long. It doesn't grow dense enough to keep out weeds, but in the woods where there's some leaves mixed with it, I don't have many weeds growing with it. You can get cultivars in different colors. This is kind of the natural color, but it comes in white and pink and some other colors as well. And this is a native iris that we have. There are a number of species. Would be one that would grow in this area other than the iris cristata that I already talked about. This is a native wetland iris, but you can grow it in average garden soil as long as it doesn't get too dry. It blooms in May. Columbine, the American columbine, is the native species here in the eastern United States. There are some other species out west, including a blue one. This will grow in full sun if it's not too dry or light shade. It will self-sow again if there's not a lot of mulch around. And this is a plant that will attract hummingbirds. Butterfly weed is a native milkweed. It's late to appear in the spring, so if you have it planted, don't start digging because there's a bare spot in your border thinking that there's nothing there, because it doesn't appear until late April or May at all. Blooms in the midsummer, likes sun and heat. Butterflies like it, which is why it's called butterfly weed. Monarch caterpillars will feed on the foliage. It's taprooted, which has both good and bad points. That means it's drought tolerant. It also means it's very difficult to transplant. So it's better to either grow it from seed or buy plants from a nursery that are in pots. And this is our native honeysuckle. Most of you, again, are probably familiar with the Japanese honeysuckle, which has yellow white flowers and smells sweet. This one doesn't have much smell. And it's a hummingbird plant, blooms in the summer, and it's longer blooming than the Japanese honeysuckle. The Japanese honeysuckle kind of has a burst of bloom, I guess, in June, and then it's sort of done for the year. This blooms sporadically through most of the summer. So those are some of my favorite native plants. So I guess we're ready for questions.
Certainly. Well, thank you, Dave. You have really given us a whole lot to think about, and I have a list of questions for you. But to let other people in on the questioning, let me give you some reminders of how to ask questions through Zoom. You can raise your hand or use the chat box feature. Remember, to raise your hand, you move your mouse to the bottom of your Zoom window and a menu will appear, or at the top of your screen if you're using an iPad. Tap on the participant button and that will bring up a list of participants. At the bottom of the participant list, you will see a raised hand box. Click on that and then you will see a dialog box and you can ask your question and allow us to unmute you. And then you'll click yes, and then your mic will be unmuted so you can ask your question. Or another very popular way of asking questions is just to use the chat box feature at the bottom of your Zoom. And then type your question in and I'll read it aloud. And in chat, you can send the message to everyone or just the pull down menu and send the message to a single participant. So kind of to get our thoughts going on questions, I have a handful of them, Dave, and I hope they'll be real easy for you. One thing I want to ask about just native plantings in general, do you consider them costing more than maybe the average landscaping? Like, you know, I go to the Lowe's or the Home Depot to get my plants. What do you think about changing over to natives?
I think if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, you will find a very few native plants, but not many. You're going to have to go to another nursery. One local nursery, I'm drawing a blank on the name of it. There's a couple of local Carroll County nurseries that specialize in native plants. and I'm drawing a blank.
Well, it'll come to you.
I'll think of it
Basically,
later.
is it more
I
expensive?
think as far as cost, you're going to have to go to what I would call a real nursery as opposed to a big box store to find native plants. And they're going to cost a little more than they would at Lowe's or Home Depot. But I think they're worth it. And there are a lot of gardeners out there that have native plants that can share, because some of these native plants do spread. So talk to other gardener friends and contact master gardeners. So yeah, they're available. And some of the things I showed, like the oak leaf hydrangea, you might even find that at Lowe's or Home Depot in some cultivar of it.
Is there a tag or something? Is there a way to see that it's a native? Do they demonstrate that somehow?
I'm not sure they do at Lowe's and Home Depot. Some nurseries will tag things as natives, but I don't think they do. But a lot of, if you go to what I would call a real nursery, they would typically, if it's not tagged that way, they can tell you this is a native, somebody that knows more about plants than the folks at the big box stores.
Okay. So my next question is morphing to another real general one. Do you find you're able to do kind of seasonal colors so that your garden always has something interesting with natives?
Yes and no. I live on a wooded lot, so my garden is at its best in April, May, and early June, because I have a lot of those spring ephemerals that I talked about. But I also have hybrid. I have a lot of non-natives as well. I have azaleas and rhododendrons. Right now I have Cardinal Flower and the blue Lobelia blooming. I've got some purple Coneflower. So I do try to have things through the season. I also have window boxes and pots. I put things out in pots and stick them here and there. Like a pathway around the back of the house, I've got things in pots. So there's some color. But if you have a sunny lot, it's easy to have things blooming all summer. Because a lot of the natives, like the coneflowers and other things like that, like sun.
All right, so now here's another elementary question. So with natives, it seems like the flowers are less showy and they're smaller. Sometimes they're literally under the leaves. Do natives help our bee population, which is in so much trouble, or do, flowers that you're so showy, do they kind of work better with the bees?
But if you have the right natives, they attract the pollinators. The butterfly weed is a candy to a lot of different species of butterflies. The coneflowers, both kinds I showed you, the purple one and the Rubeckia triloba, are butterfly plants and bee plants. At my house, a lot of bumblebees come to those. When my oak leaf hydrangea was blooming, some sort of small bees or something were flocking around that. I'm not sure what they were. Didn't attract butterflies or anything like that, but yeah, there were pollinators coming to that as well. The only one I mentioned where you don't see the flowers is the wild ginger, and something comes and pollinates it, but I think it's something that probably creeps along the ground, ants or beetles or something like that. I'm not sure. But again, you don't grow that one for the flowers. But yes, a lot of the native plants do benefit pollinators. A couple of the things I mentioned are food for hummingbirds, cardinal flower, the honeysuckle, and the red buckeye. So those three attract hummingbirds.
All right, now I have another question. I'm a hydrangea lover myself. I have a Victorian house with one of those old blue hydrangeas around it.
Well, I shouldn't disparage them, but they're not my favorite.
Well, you are with the Historical Society tonight, so we will forgive you. But, I was listening closely to your presentation, and you mentioned that there's a draft hydrangea out there that is native, or there's a native hydrangea out there that there might be a dwarf kind. Once you get into manipulated plants, are they still considered native?
That's a point of discussion among gardeners. Some people would say that some of the plants I showed aren't native because they're not found in Carroll County naturally. They're found somewhere in the eastern United States, but not necessarily in Carroll County. I'm not that strict in my definition.
Oh, wow. Well, this sounds like it'd be fun to go out and to eat with you guys and have a debate.
Yeah, well, I mean, even if you look in different books, some will have a stricter definition of what's native than others. I I kind of prefer natives, but I don't think they have to be native to even Maryland, much less Carroll County. If they're native to the East Coast, that's good enough for me.
All right. All right. So we've got a pretty liberal gardener here. All right. I'm going to go to see if there's any chat questions, and I'm going to take them in the order that I received them. I have from Jess. She says, I know Wakefield Valley Nursery in New Windsor have some great selections of natives, and their websites have lots of good inventory information on it. So thank you for that comment, Jess. I have a question. Is that true?
That's the nursery I was trying to think of, Wakefield Valley. They're really good.
Okay, great. I have from Sue, what are the native black-eyed Susan flowers you showed? Thank you.
That one's Rubeckia triloba, three-lobed coneflower. Typically, what you see it planted a lot is a different Rubeckia solvanti or something like that. Goldstar is the cultivar that everybody plants everywhere. And technically it's native, but it's a little too common, I think.
All right. I also have from Marianne and Gregory that Wakefield Valley Nursery and Bowman's may have some. Is that true?
I think if you look around Bowman's, they would have some natives because again, they're not a big box. They're a real nursery. So yeah, I think natives there.
So I have a question from T. Thanks. I have numerous flocks. What are the name of the non-native ones?
Well, like I said, one of my books said that every kind of phlox there is originated as a native North American species, except for one that's from Asia, and I don't know the name of that one, but I don't think anybody in Carroll County grows it because I never heard of it. But all these cultivars, like the garden phlox, the tall phlox that everybody's grandmother had in their garden and many of us have now, is a native species. The wild version is pink, and you can get it in all sorts of colors now. But if you let those go to seed, the seedlings often are pink. They revert back to what looks like the original native plant anyway. So, but and like the phlox that everybody plants on banks as a ground cover, that's a native plant. If you go over to Soldier's Delight in Baltimore County, there's wild creeping phlox over there. Not the kind I was showing, but moss phlox is another name for it.
All right, well, we have another question from Bill Palm. He wants to know, what attracted you to native plants initially?
Okay, as a kid, I was always interested in being outside and I like nature. And then I went to college and majored in biology and got a master's degree in ecology. And then about 35 years ago, my wife and I bought this wooded lot and built a log house on it. And so I'm trying to find things that will grow in the shade. And there are a lot of non-natives that will grow in the shade, but natives do particularly well there. So that's part of it. But I don't know, my interest in nature, I guess.
So Bill says, do you have a suggestion for shade-loving native ground cover?
Well, the wild ginger that I showed, and then the Phlox stolonifera, and also that one sedum, are the three that have come to mind.
Well, I'm sure there's that sounds great.
And the Pachysandra as well.
Okay. All right. Now, Bill also asked you, what's a good source of information? Are there good reference books out there?
There are, and I didn't bring any of them with me or the titles, but I'll share with Bill some of them, but I can't come up with any off the top of my head.
All right, great. Well, I know
I have
Our
several books
library is
at home that I
gaining more and
refer
more
to.
books.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
I was going to say, I know our reference library at the Historical Society is getting more and more books on uh, plants and nature. So Bill responds here. He says, a great resource of information about natives is the Chesapeake Gardening and Landscape book.
Okay.
All right.
I think I've seen that one.
All right. I have Susie tossed in that Snell's has oak leaf hydrangeas and some native perennials. Thank you, Susie. From Andrea, Nine Bark has proven very adaptable to my native garden. Have you had any experience with this shrub?
It's one I've seen in books, but I have never grown it, or I have no experience with it. But I know it's one that's become popular recently.
All right. And also Susie tosses in the University of Maryland Extension website is a great resource. I don't know why we didn't think of that right off. That would be great.
Yep.
All right. And we have from Julian, would the Buckeye, friends, Bottlebrush and Red, tolerate full sun or do they need shade?
Like I said, at my house, I planted it. Both places were light shade. One was dry. It didn't like it. It liked the moist shade better. A book I have says that it doesn't like sun. I don't have personal experience, but I think that's probably correct, that it needs at least light shade.
Okay, and Teeth says, Bringing Nature Home by Doug Talamai. It must be a good reference. It's what it's implying.
That one, but.
All right, I have another question for you that's just from me personally. Is the saucer magnolia considered native?
No, that's the pink one that blooms in early spring. That's Oriental. But there's another one, Sweet Bay magnolia, that's native as well. I didn't show that one. I think it grows this far north along the coast naturally, but you can grow it in Carroll County. It doesn't get as big, and this far north it's not evergreen. Further south it would be evergreen, and it blooms in the summer. But yes, but the saucer magnolia, that's the pink one that blooms in the early spring. That's Oriental.
Ooh, that's too bad. I have a huge one at my house.
Nothing wrong with it. It's just not a native plant. The only drawback I know to that one is it typically blooms really early in the spring, and some years the flowers, just as they're starting to bloom, they turn brown because of frost.
Yes. Well, it's funny, my mom died on tax day, April 15th, and it always seems to be in full bloom for that day. So that's how I always remember when to expect my saucer magnolia to bloom.
Right.
All righty. Well, I see no more questions. Wait, one more thing just popped on the screen. Two more things just popped on the screen. T says also native plants for wildlife habitat and conservation landscaping by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Chesapeake Bay Watershed. That must be another good reference book. And Lynn Wheeler asks, with changing climate, how does the impact change the definition of native?
That's a good question. I know some species are already extending their range further north than they used to. Animals do it quicker than plants, but even the plants are starting to survive winters further north than they once did. So I guess if Spanish moss starts surviving the winter in Maryland, then it's a native plant. I don't know.
Oh my goodness. Well, that seems to be the end of our questions. So I'm going to start by saying that, most of you know who are watching us, that we typically charge an entrance fee for our talks at the Tavern. There's a sliding fee, $5 for members and a little bit more for non-members. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please go to our homepage, hsccmd.org. And at the top right-hand side of the homepage, you can click to donate. and any amount you wish. Small gifts all add up and make a huge difference to us. I have several upcoming events I'd like to mention, and first I'd like, however, to thank our partners, the Community Media Center, the Carroll Nonprofit Center, and Cone Creative for helping us present and promote these virtual events. So in the spirit of announcing things on Saturday, there will be the Heirloom Tomato Festival, which is preserving history. That's going to be on Saturday, and it's virtual. So just go to the Master Gardeners website and you can click onto that. Next week, we're going to be having our new exhibit called Breaking Barriers, and it'll be at Cockey's Tavern on the Historical Society campus, which is next door to Kimmey House at 210 East Main Street. So it's a celebration of how our local Carroll Countians broke barriers in the last century since women got the vote 100 years ago this week. The campus is available for touring. It's just with the new COVID environment, we're asking for RSVPs Tuesdays through Saturdays, 10 to 4. Just call the Historical Society at 410-848-6494 for your touring time. And that way, you know you won't get in a crush with other people with masks on. So you'll want to come and see our new exhibit. On Friday, September 11th at 6 p.m., we'll be holding our annual fundraising bluegrass concert. It's featuring the nationally known bluegrass group called Sideline. And their music wowed our group last year at Rob's Bluegrass Barn. Jennifer Mulch is our board secretary, and her committee has worked really hard on this event. For more information, get on our website, again, at hsccmd.org. This will be a free will event. So consider bringing your picnic basket, something to drink, and a chair to sit under the stars. There will be no admission charged. Again, we'll just be passing the hat for this. And we'll be asking again that you wear your masks and you stay socially distanced. But Rob's Bluegrass Barn has a great big lawn and everybody can spread out and be safe. So also, we'd like you to please join us for our first virtual gala. It'll be hosted on Saturday, September 12th from 7 to 8 p.m. Our theme again is, for this whole year, is Breaking Barriers. It's our nod again to the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women right to vote. During the hour-long program, we will have all kinds of entertainment, clips of Carroll County people who have broken barriers. There will be a silent and live auction that'll be offered. It will be a fun night, and we'll even have some trivia questions leading up to that event to kind of get you interested and in the swing of joining us on this virtual event. It will be on cable channel HD 1086, or through some of our streaming links you can get off of our website. We'll be streaming on YouTube and Facebook. And once again, this will be a free event. So we're looking for donations and people to bid on our silent auctions. And it's really very, very important for us to survive the pandemic. So we need all that community help we can get. Our next box lunch will be about the Western Maryland Railroad past and present. It'll be September 15th. Again, it'll be a virtual event from 12 to 1. The speaker is Jim Shriver. He's on our board. And he writes, it was on June 15th, 1861, that the blast of a train whistle was first heard in Westminster as the Westminster Maryland Railroad arrived in town. This presentation explores the development of the history of the line, its impact on Carroll County and the state of Maryland, and its place in the era of American railroad expansion. I really look forward to that because it started right in the midst of the Civil War. So that ought to be super interesting. Then our next talk at the Tavern will be September 24th from 7 to 8. Again, it'll be a virtual event here. And it'll be about Westminster High School contributions to the greatest generation. And that speaker is Steve Bowersox. He's a history teacher, and he ought to have some great information. He's a history teacher at Westminster High School, and he began researching the connection of the Westminster High to World War II right up through 2007. In 2007, he began that research. He has been able to place over 650 Westminster High School students, male and female, in service of World War II. The students served all over the world and participated in every major campaign of the military. And he will share some of their stories. So I think that ought to be also a really interesting program. That's it for tonight's talk at the Tavern. We really appreciate you joining us with the Carroll County Historical Society. And I thank our speakers and all of you for joining us. Thank you. Good night.